Hi friends, welcome back to my series about MMOs. In the last video, I left off by looking forward to the future of the genre, what I believe to be the upcoming renaissance. I said that I wanted to take an in-depth look at Pantheon, Rise of the Fallen, and share my perspective. What I stated in the first part also applies here. The following is my opinion. I won't be revealing any information that isn't readily available. I'll merely be sharing my own perspective on it. If you haven't watched the first video in this series yet, I recommend you go take a look. It isn't strictly necessary, but it'll give you a better idea of where I'm coming from. I'll leave a link in the description below. I want to start by talking about nostalgia as it applies to gaming. Sometimes when we talk about nostalgia, we imagine it as an ambiguous feeling. Something about the way the wind hits your face or certain pleasant smells will invoke a specific but ultimately unidentifiable longing for a past time. When I think about it in terms of gaming, it comes to me as more of a functional nostalgia. I think I made this term up, so let me explain what I mean. When we're nostalgic for video games, I think we're partially accessing memories of the sensibilities of those games. We're remembering the specific challenges that the game provided and how we overcame them. We're remembering our specific interactions with the world of the game, and in my opinion, we're remembering the wonder of the game and our inspiration by its novelty. I think if you look at certain phenomena in the MMO genre, you can see concrete examples of this. In the past few years, private servers boasting vanilla versions of games have been thriving. There are countless vanilla WoW servers, at least for as long as Activision allows them to stay up. There's a classic Warhammer Online server out there, and a classic Daeok server that just launched recently. And that's not even mentioning the trend of companies that own these titles starting their own classic servers. Daybreak, the studio that currently owns EverQuest, has put up time-locked progression servers in the past few years. Lord of the Rings Online has recently implemented the same thing. And perhaps most notably, Blizzard and Activision have been teasing official vanilla servers for some time. And last but not least, there's Project 1999, the one I'm most familiar with. In the past, when friends have asked me in regards to Project 1999, why are you playing a 20-year-old game? My answer was often, I don't know, I guess I'm just masochistic. But I think that's actually a disingenuous answer. I think I enjoy playing it because it's a way to tap into my own personal, functional nostalgia. And to a degree, it works, because after 20 years or so, remembering the novelty is just as effective as being inspired by it for the first time. However, if I'm being honest, I don't think that this concept can stand on its own as a driving design principle. Nostalgia, as powerful as it is, isn't sustainable as the foundation of a game. I believe that Visionary Realms has a good handle on this disparity, and I'll use a quote from the Pantheon FAQ to illustrate this assumption. Quote, "Pantheon is most definitely a modern MMO with modern graphics and new and exciting features and mechanics. There are already emulators out there that are clones of earlier MMOs, and Visionary Realms has no desire to make another emulator. That said, we also feel that many of the features and mechanics of previous MMOs have been abandoned in more recent years, resulting in a less challenging, compelling, deep, and social experience. Pantheon, therefore, will indeed bring back some of these conventional mechanics and ideas, but with a fresh perspective, some tweaks and revisions. We also understand that while gamers' tastes don't fundamentally change over time, their situations, lives, and responsibilities do. Likewise, some game mechanics often associated with earlier MMOs involved inordinate amounts of downtime, overly severe penalties, too much competition over content and resources, and even downright boring or overly repetitive gameplay. Our intention, therefore, is not to bring back everything from the old days, but rather to pick and choose those which make sense and are needed to make a fun, social, cooperative, and challenging game. I believe this is a realistic outlook that answers the call of nostalgia without using it as a crutch. I personally think it is possible to appreciate the sensibilities of older games while also acknowledging that functional nostalgia is due in large part to the fact that those sensibilities were new and wondrous. If Visionary Realms is to succeed, it has to look at its players 10 years down the road and ask if Pantheon created nostalgia for them. So the question now is, how is this particular brand of nostalgia created? I mentioned in the first part of this series that Visionary Realms and other studios responding to the call of nostalgia have acknowledged that to start innovating in this genre, it's important to first re-establish the basics. To me, this is evident if you read the first part of the Pantheon difference. Quote, Pantheon Rise of the Fallen will likely be a fundamentally different game compared to what you may have experienced playing other modern MMORPGs. From the moment you log in, you will notice that the game is more social and has an emphasis on cooperative play. The monsters are often tougher and exploration is more involved. You will need friends in the game and your reputation can either help you progress or hinder it. Death in-game is meaningful and you'll want to avoid it when possible. You'll learn your surroundings and the lay of the land, spend meaningful time in each area, and not just running through as quickly as possible to collect 10 hides. You will need strategy, cunning, and endurance to uncover all that Pantheon has to offer. You will find yourself in group and guild chats as you strategize or even just pass the time between battles. Pantheon is social, thought-provoking, and the memories from your experiences in Terminus will last a lifetime. I recommend reading the entirety of the Pantheon Difference on VR's website, because it includes specifics as to how they're going to engage these sensibilities. And much of it is definitely compelling, with interesting ideas such as the progeny system. But I want to take this opportunity to outline my own imaginary innovations. The following are a few simple ways I feel that Pantheon, or really any yet unreleased MMORPG, could stand out from the crowd. I crafted this list using 3 simple rules. 1. The idea should extend some novelty from the golden age of MMOs that has been lost in the dark age. 2. The idea should feel like a fresh innovation, without being muddled in obscurity. And 3. Simply, the idea should be relatively easy to implement. It just so happens that, following these rules, I've developed some ideas that tend to imitate real life to some degree. I think this is because of rules 1 and 2, both because early MMOs took place in somewhat familiar worlds, and because the opposite of obscurity is familiarity, but that's neither here nor there. Here are the ideas. I'm sure a lot of us remember playing EverQuest and doing something like this. You level up enough to go to Crushbone and collect some belts. Then, you beg a druid to teleport you to West Commonlands. Maybe if you're lucky, that same druid will give you a Spirit of Wolf. Then, you run to East Commonlands, to the tunnel, to sell your belts to another player who has the money to twink out an alt. And now you have the money to buy yourself some noob gear, or your next tier of spells. What was fascinating about this is that there was no direct design that implicated the East Commonlands Tunnel as the place people go to buy, sell, and trade. The players of EverQuest just decided that. You can make the argument that there was indirect design that encouraged it, in that it was a fairly accessible place for all the races of Norath, but there were no NPC auction houses or any designer-implemented things of that nature. I think another indirect design choice could take this fascinating aspect of MMOs even further. Multiple currencies. Have you ever wondered why in MMOs the entire world uses gold coins or platinum, and while there are different denominations of those currencies, the nations or factions in these worlds never developed their own? In real life, we have the US dollar, and the European euro, and the British pound, and the Japanese yen, and so on and so forth ad infinitum. And these different currencies are valued against each other based on the temperament of a world economy. I think something as simple as building an economic history into the factions and nations of Terminus, with NPC merchants of respective regions only accepting certain currencies, could add an innovative level of depth and history into the game. And the best part is that it's ultimately an indirect design choice. VR would obviously have to manage some aspects of it, but at the end of the day, the player base would be the ones to bring it alive in exciting ways. In storytelling, there's a concept called the monomyth. I don't want to get too mired in the details because it's a lot of information, and I think I may want to include it in more depth when I eventually make a tabletop role-playing series. But in summary, the monomyth is the idea that our story has a hero, and that hero goes through particular trials and ultimately overcomes those trials to save the world. It's the premise of probably 90% of the stories you read and the scripts of the movies you watch. And it's also the driving narrative of most modern MMOs. To me, MMOs are uniquely positioned to deny the monomyth, yet a substantial majority of modern ones embrace it, and it never makes sense. I think you can make a strong argument that we don't actually need this larger-than-life narrative for our characters. Learning about a fantastical world and its history and our role in it, regardless of the weight of that role, I'd argue, is compelling enough for most players. The monomyth in the context of MMOs just doesn't offer a strong enough benefit to justify the nonsense of extraordinary circumstances occurring in the lives of thousands upon thousands of characters. My idea here is simple. When programming interactions with NPCs in the world of Terminus, a point should be made to evade the monomyth. I think interactions based on faction standing and things of that nature are ultimately fine, but I think the depth of the fiction should exist in the world building rather than an individualized narrative of mythic proportions. I have a theory that this is something that's already on Visionary Realms' minds based on their notes about NPC dispositions. Quote, "An area we have not seen much innovation in MMORPGs almost since their inception is the area of NPC AI. What if certain enemies had different dispositions that had to be discovered by the players? Many NPCs in Pantheon will have advanced behaviors, like the propensity to flee if possible, or to stand and fight to the end. Some NPCs will be inclined to help other NPCs in the area, while some will not. Some will target certain classes within the group that's attacking them. NPCs' movement speeds may vary if they feel they are outmatched. While it is too early to go into a lot of detail, some of the different dispositions we are working on include the Alarmist, the Bully, the Craven, the Opportunist, the Protector, and the Strategist." While this quote doesn't get into specifics about friendly NPCs or the narrative as a whole, we can see that innovation in these types of interactions is something that VR is acutely aware of. This is a really big concept, but I think the main thrust of it is covered by saying that I think there's innovation to be enacted in a world with a bit more chaos than we've seen to this point. I've often found myself playing an MMORPG, walking up to talk to a merchant or class trainer, and wondering things like, why is this person here at all times? Wouldn't this be like their job that they eventually go home from? This is a tiny example from within the concept of realism through chaos, but it's a decent one, I feel. Maybe the merchants and quest NPCs aren't always in one single place. Maybe they have a path and a life with a set of motivations to follow. Maybe the regions of the world aren't separated so distinctly with one concrete zone line. The best way I can illustrate this particular example is with something I know. You can get into the city of Atlanta by taking I-75, I-85, I-285, 400, or countless surface streets. You're gonna sit in traffic for 800 hours regardless, but I mean... Again, I theorize that VR is keenly aware of this concept, and another tangentially related quote makes me hopeful that we'll see some incarnation of this idea in Pantheon. Quote, "One of the most profound things about Pantheon is how we are designing the game from the ground up so that the environment truly matters. We want players to care about the world they're in, and why things are the way they are. When you think of MMOs, when's the last time you discovered the meaning, or history, or the secrets of a person, place, or event without being told by a text box? What if we've conceived a way to bring players back to exploring because they are compelled by what they see in front of them, not because a blinking light tells them to go there? In Pantheon, wizards will be able to perceive things a warrior cannot. Through prayer, a cleric may gain insight into an area or a creature that a rogue could never know. Through our perception system, Pantheon will redefine how the game world becomes known and how players will work together to progress." Okay, so I've spent way too much time sharing my own armchair innovations, but I hope in doing so I've shown as a result that Visionary Realms is taking the concept of innovation seriously. Some of the criticism I've seen online of Pantheon is that no one wants to play EverQuest Reborn into the modern era. I totally get that sentiment, and at the same time, I don't think that's what VR is aiming for with Pantheon. I think it can be a difficult idea to convey, but I feel like VR has shown promise, at the very least, in designing Pantheon to appreciate the spirit of older games, but ultimately innovate within the genre. I think after this video especially, I'm going to be accused of being a stupidly optimistic fanboy, so let me set the record straight. I am. Unapologetically. But this doesn't mean that I don't have the capacity to have realistic concerns. Having concerns for upcoming MMOs is just good practice in today's day and age, and in my opinion, the studios developing them should embrace it. It ultimately means that the audience cares about the product they're eventually going to ask them to support financially. I would say that my biggest concern at this stage regarding Pantheon is the distinct lack of a transparent development timeline. I guess you could argue that VR has been transparent by saying, there is no timeline, it'll be done when it's done. And I can certainly empathize with that sentiment, being that one of the most critical mistakes that many MMORPGs have made was releasing an incomplete product. There's definitely a mystique and contentment with hearing a developer say, we're not going to put it out there until it's done. However, every major successful project that I've personally been involved in has had some kind of timeline, even an ambiguous one. I work in software dev, so I know it's different, but project management is a good thing. It keeps things flowing and on track, and in my opinion, it should be celebrated instead of obscured. Even if VR were to say, we will launch before 2022, that would feel like a bit of a hit because it's pretty far away, but it's still a lot better than the zero information that's accessible to us at this moment. I don't want it to sound like I'm trying to rush the developers of Pantheon. I'm not entitled to do that. Project organization, though, isn't the same thing as artificial project acceleration. Furthermore, I don't know that asking for a project timeline some 5 years after development was announced can reasonably be called rushing. For a lot of people, Pantheon represents the last best hope for the MMORPG genre. This is especially true for me since I've now made 2 full videos, at least in part, about that exact point. I can't speak for others obviously, but I know for me, a project timeline would go a longer way towards strengthening my belief in the project than the pointed, it'll be done when it's done attitude. Saying that Pantheon is only the last hope is a bit cynical. I prefer the phrasing, the last best hope for the MMORPG genre. I used the term Renaissance in my first video because I think it's an apt analogy. For me, and from what I've seen many others, the genre is diminished. A lot of the magic that these games brought to our lives has faded away for the reasons I discussed in part 1. My hope is that a game can come along and breathe life back into this genre for me. And at this moment in time, I think Pantheon stands the best chance of being the game that does so. I hope you've enjoyed my perspective on Pantheon and the future of MMOs. After seeing some of the response to and critique of the first video in this series, I feel compelled to make a third part with some corrections and addenda, so be on the lookout for that. Thanks for watching.